I wanted to pop onto YouTube and make this video about 15 points on, if only I had an extra hand, 15 points on avoiding deception. This comes from a piece of writing I found where I literally wrote down advice on how to avoid deception. I wrote it like 3 years ago and I stumbled upon it and I'm like, I just want everyone to know this. And so I'm going to turn it into a YouTube video. So no point in rambling on, I will dive straight into it. Point number 1 is everyone thinks that they are an exception. People believe that they can see right above, right through deception. Everyone thinks that they're immune to it. It's just natural. Even if you've been told your whole life you are smarter than average, more mature than average, insightful, even if you are someone who is esteemed for your intelligence, maybe you do amazing in academics at school, maybe just all of that comes very naturally to you, even if you have even a lot of Bible knowledge, because we're talking about mainly Christian deception here, right? Getting deceived kind of away from the faith or to believe false things about God. Even if you've read the Bible through 10 times in your life or more, you are not immune to deception. And that is the thing. That is the thing that gets us deceived, is we all think we're immune even though we're not. And so even it almost feels in vain saying this, because I think that if my past self who was deceived were to watch this, I still would have thought I was immune. So it's just kind of one of those things. But yes, everyone thinks that they are an exception. So point number 2 is good intentions are not a safeguard to being led astray. Paul says in Romans 10:2 that people can have zeal without knowledge. Even if you are the most caring and selfless and God-loving person, does not keep you from deception. There are sincere Mormons, there are sincere Jehovah's Witnesses, and you can use that category for really anything. So remember, you can be both sincere and sincerely deceived. So point number 3. Sometimes deception is not just informative. Sometimes it can go along with manipulated feelings, feelings or experiences that feel very real to you. It's almost like a whole separate reality. And that is something I could talk far more about, having severely experienced that, and probably could make a whole nother video about it at some point in the future. Point number 4, the devil can perform miracles too. And this is something that we see throughout all scripture. In Matthew 24:24, Jesus states that there will be great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. And also 2 Thessalonians 2:9 states, the coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. He will use all sorts of displays of power through signs and wonders that serve the lie. So that kind of goes with the point I just made beforehand, and something I could talk a lot more about is do not think that, just because you see all these seeming wonders or you had these crazy experiences, that it is true or that it is from God. Okay, so point number 5 also kind of goes along with the last 2 points, but I am convinced that there is no limit to the extent of how deceptive deception can be. Honestly, even if a UFO were to appear out of the sky, it would not destroy my faith because of all the crazy stuff I have experienced that I later came to realize was only counterfeit. And so Galatians 1:8 says, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. An angel declaring a message from heaven would be pretty convincing, I feel like. We just really have to realize that deception is actually deceptive. Okay, so point number 6. Just because there are more radical deceptions going on does not mean that you are not deceived in a more subtle way. But just because there are more radical examples out there does not mean that there isn't deception in the more subtle things. Like Charles Spurgeon said, deception is not telling between just good and bad. It's also, or right and wrong, it's also right and almost right. So point number 7 is that counterfeits are designed to look like the real thing. So usually, like within the context of a false teacher or a false prophet, they will be saying 90% truth or whatever number. And sometimes the lie grows to a greater percentage over time, but it looks the same. But what is interesting is the Old Testament word for discernment has to do with a space. And that is because someone with discernment is able to look at two things that look the exact same and see the space of difference between them. And like also Hebrews 5:14 talks about discernment has to do with also growing in spiritual maturity. They're kind of linked together. And it is important to realize that, you know, when we're born again as believers, we're not born with wisdom. It is something that we grow in and we acquire over time. It's not like instantly attained in spiritual birth, and it's something to be exercised and to grow in. Okay, so point number 8 is that Scripture is designed and written in a way for us to keep checks and balances with it. We interpret Scripture by other Scripture. And like an example of this that I have written down is like a lot of hyper-grace teachers will just be like, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, Romans 10:13, without applying the parameters of not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. To fully get the full context of one verse, we have to compare all the other verses that have to do with that subject. And so we see this when Satan tested Jesus in the desert. He would quote one section of scripture and Jesus would put it back into its proper balance by quoting the other half, not other half, but the other scripture. So it is very important to keep in mind that scripture is written for that use, to have those checks and balances. Point number 9, sola scriptura is key. If you do not believe the word is the final say, and if you don't believe it's the final authority, it takes the ground from underneath your feet and makes you vulnerable to deception. So we are to be like the Bereans in Acts 17 and test everything that we can to the scripture, because it is a light to our feet. It guides our path. And there's no way in even avoiding deception without it. So any new information you ever hear about God, it is irresponsible to not bring it and test it according to the scripture before believing it first. Okay, number 10 is a point I kind of wish I made earlier because I hope I'm not stressing out anyone here. But it's okay not to know the answer to something. No one knows the answer to everything, not within knowing all the answers within Christianity even. Like, it's okay to not know the answer to something. It just, like, I think we are only to judge the things that concern us and that involve us. And we're not responsible to analyze all that comes along. Because then we can become judgmental Christians, right? That's not the goal. That's certainly not who I want to be. It reminds me of that time when Peter asked Jesus a question about another disciple, and he said, "What does that concern you? Follow me." I think as it is for everyone, there'll be a lot of surprises when it comes to the judgment seat. I think, like it says, and I believe 2 Peter, we just need to keep our eyes on the prize and expose ourselves to what benefits us most in our faith, that helps us run the race and keep our eyes on Jesus, because we are to not get distracted by these other things, right? And really do what it says to do in Scripture. So unless it personally involves you, is a threat to you or your faith or the faith of others around you, there's no need to get distracted by it, right? We can just cram as much good fruit into our lives and get busy for the Lord without getting distracted by things that shouldn't concern us. But do remember, if there is actual danger that you can help avoid that is personally impacting you, checks and balances with Scripture, right? It says, snatch your brothers and sisters away from the fire in Jude. It talks about protecting those. It talks about like telling the truth and calling out false prophets if it does concern you. So that's just a check and balance to keep in mind with Scripture. But if it doesn't concern you, then don't give it any additional thought or any unnecessary judgment. Okay, number 11, and this is a point that I really didn't get until much later on, is that discernment without wisdom ends in disaster. The two need to be paired. You can have all the right discernment in the world, but if you're going around and just criticizing everyone from a haughty place in your heart and not out of a place of love, that's not going to do any good fruit. You have to know and use and exercise wisdom. When is the times to keep silent? When is the times to correct and say something? How to correct and say something in order to produce that fruit of people having corrected understanding. And usually what I have found is that, like, we don't change other people's minds. We don't have that power, but we can plant seeds to help them have their mind changed by God, if that makes sense. A lot of times it will be the people themselves that will just change their own minds, but that starts with the seeds that we plant. So when God opens their eyes, they're able to receive the truth that they already know. Okay, point number 12 is to listen to those around you. Even if the person giving you advice you don't deem as mature or intelligent, wisdom starts with humility, and it is so important just to consider what they say. God has placed those people into your life, and He could be using them to try to protect you. And it's a really humbling experience because everyone has the desire to be right. We all want to be right. Well, acknowledging that we're not right on something is a very, very humbling experience. But we must remember that being right is not always the most important thing. Okay, point number 13 is do not let anything take your eyes off Jesus. Do not let anything undermine the work of the cross that He's done. Keep Him as your center, keep Him as your focus, and His gospel and what He's done as your focus, because deceivers will try to take your eyes off of this. And also remember, I think it's really interesting that Christianity is the only worldview where even there is a purpose to deception. It's the only worldview that provides a reason for why deception even exists. The existence of deception doesn't even make sense through any other worldview. And so, we have been warned, that deceivers will come and the seriousness of that. So it's so important to always just keep Jesus as the center and remember that His sacrifice for you is the most important thing that has ever happened in all of existence. Point number 14 is just to love the truth and want the truth even if you don't like the truth. And there is a thing called confirmation bias where a lot of the times the problem is not that someone is deceived, it's just that they don't want the truth. They just want a truth that they are comfortable with. And, it says in 2 Thessalonians that they perish because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. And so many people will read the Bible with different classes on. If they have a theological bent this way, they will believe, like, for example, if there is like a person who has an attitude of, oh, we can live our lives however we want, Jesus will love us the same way, well, all those verses that just kind of don't say that will just kind of disappear to them, right? And if you're like a legalist and someone who is very extreme on just salvation by works, well, all the other contrary scriptures will be underemphasized or not, talked about. And so we have to let the scriptures change us rather than us trying to change them. Okay, point number 15. Prayer is powerful. We should not underestimate the power of God to pull someone out of deception, no matter how long it takes, no matter how deep the deception is. God protects the simple-hearted, and he opens the eyes of the blind. And I was just kind of blown away after, it was really after, in my own experience, I started calling out to him and said, like, God, I just really at this point don't even care what the truth is. I don't want to be confused anymore. What is the truth? And he started really working with me just to pull me out of the deception I was in. And the Bible and just the sufficiency of scripture in verses I had read so many times but had never even noticed before. I was just blown away by the sufficiency of it all to really bring me to the place I needed to be. So that is all I have to say in this video. I wrote this down, all of what I said 3 years ago, so hopefully it's provided some use to someone, and it's just something that we should always take with us. Just because I've been through deception before does not mean I can't be deceived again, just because, I had this experience. So that's also something for me personally to keep in mind. And also another thing that I didn't put in there back then that I would add to this is I think it's really good to study logical fallacies. Just read a couple of them online. They're really helpful, and they can be used in a lot of different situations, whether it has to do with politics, whether it has to do with just anything really. And it's really, I guess, good to know. And so if you can think of any additional things you would add to this list, comment it below. Well, I never know how to end videos, but thank you so much for watching, and bye.